name is Curt Wetzel, and I'm going to talk about a very interesting 19th century baseball player who was from East Liverpool, and his name was Curtis Benton Welch. And he was known mostly through his playing years as Curt Welch. He was, in the latter part of the 19th century, known as the King of Center Field. And he's still considered to be one of the greatest outfielders of the 19th century, defensive outfielders. And for quite a few years, even into what's known as the live ball era, there were still people referencing anytime a new center fielder would come up into the majors, there were people speculating on whether he would be the new Curt Welch or comparing him to Curt Welch. Though, other than real serious baseball aficionados, he's pretty much unknown today. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are baseball fans?
To a degree.
Okay. His parents were John and Margaret Welch, and they were both Irish, and they were married in 1846, and they got right to work because by the time Curtis was born in 1862, he was their seventh child. They lived on a farm in Madison Township in the 1850 and 1860 censuses. He's listed as a farmer. And as near as I can figure, looking through old maps, near as I can figure where the location of their farm was just about at the intersection of where Wino Road and Route 30 are today, somewhere in that general area. And there is a little cemetery up at the intersection of 30 and 7 there behind the little superette, the little store there. And there's a couple of their relatives buried there. But I haven't been there yet. I just looked online, but I don't think they are buried there. By 1870, sometime before Curt was 8 years old, they had moved to East Liverpool. And the elder Welch was working in the pottery industry as a cooper. And pretty much the rest of the time, the family were always working in potteries. There are a few different stories on how Curt Welch actually got started playing baseball. He did play for the local teams here in East Liverpool, the Crockery City Boys. And I have a couple stories that I pulled out of newspapers. It's interesting when usually when you're researching someone, it's difficult finding information on them. With him, I searched just in one newspaper, the Sporting Life it was called. It was sort of like the Sports Illustrated of its day. In the latter half of the 19th century, it was a Philadelphia newspaper. And there were thousands of references to Curt Welch just in that one newspaper. And not counting everything that I found in the local newspapers, in the Sporting News, another big newspaper. So there are often contrary and conflicting stories, some of which are obviously apocryphal and some that have a more ring of authenticity. According to the Sporting Life in 1888, this is the story of how Curt Welch got into professional baseball. He said, during June 1877, the Crockeries went to Steubenville to play the Ohio boys of that city. The Crockeries were in poor shape, their regular catcher being temporarily disabled by the swift delivery of their pitcher, Pickle. They were in a loss what to do when someone jestingly proposed to take Curt Welch, then a slim-built lad of 15 years old. No other player was available, so the lad was taken along with many misgivings. Probably no player ever went on a ball field who was worse guide than the Crockery City catcher when his team took the field. Welch was certainly not a stylish-looking object. His wardrobe consisted of a pair of pants, sadly out of repair, a check shirt, and a dilapidated straw hat with part of the brim still gone. And that is basically the story that you hear about how he got started in Major League Baseball. I found one from someone, this is from the Review in 1935, a gentleman by the name of Art Bowman, who played baseball in the area and remembered Curt Welch quite well. He said he remembers the first game played by Curt Welch against a team outside of East Liverpool with an aggregation that represented Steubenville. The contest was played in Steubenville. Tom Pickle again pitched that game. During it, the catcher became incapacitated and Curt Welch came in from the outfield and caught the remainder of this game in his bare feet, discarding his shoes. So I think that's most likely what happened. I doubt they would have picked someone to play that hadn't even played baseball before. This same man on Avondale Street is where he lived. He also remembered when they first built the West End ballpark, which is in the basic location where Patterson Field is today. He said that Curt Welch and one of his brothers and him were with those who helped clear out the field, throw rocks off the field to when they first started playing at the West End ball field. I assume that was before they had built a grandstand or anything like that. And since I have no particular place to show these are two pictures I printed out of Curt Welch that you can pass around so you know who I'm talking about. He was on several baseball cards through the years, but most of them are pretty primitive. That one is basically the only one that actually shows him. By the time Curt Welch started playing baseball, sometime in the 1870s, baseball had pretty much already been established as the American pastime. It was quite popular. The Red Stockings, the first completely professional team, had been formed in '69, I believe it was, the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And then in 1876, the National League was formed, and this is the National League that is still in existence today. One thing that's quite confusing with dealing with old baseball teams in the 19th century is that they often have the same names as teams from today, and they're no relation whatsoever to those teams. There was one of the early teams, for instance, was the New York Metropolitans, and that's where they got the New York Mets, even though they're totally unrelated. Curt Welch's first professional year was 1883, and he was hired by the Toledo Blue Stockings, which at that time were in what was known as the International League. It was a professional league. It's not considered a major league. It's probably about equivalent with AAA today. He signed with the Toledo Blue Stockings for $110 a month, which was excellent money back then. That was several times the average pay for a worker back then. And then in the next year, in 1884, the Toledo Blue Stockings suddenly became a major league team when they joined a new league, fairly new league, called the American Association. And the American Association is quite fascinating. It was basically formed in 1881, I think. In late 1881, it was formed by and large by brewers. And I think that while they may have enjoyed baseball, they all also wanted a venue to sell beer. And they got together, they had their founding meeting in Pittsburgh, and they got together and made what is known as the American Association. And it's considered a major league today. Their level of play was that high. Mostly when you hear about it, it's known as the Beer and Whiskey League. The National League, which had been formed in 1876, was primarily catered to middle class people. And they were like your uptight grandmother, more or less. There was no baseball on Sundays. There was no alcohol whatsoever sold at the games. And they charged 50 cents a piece for admission. The American Association, all these brewers, when they came along, they charged 25 cents a piece. They had copious amounts of alcohol available, and the worst thing of all, they also scheduled games on Sunday. And that caused them quite a bit of trouble. There was one time when there was actually part of the team arrested for playing baseball on Sunday, and the opposition to that, they call them the Sabbatarians, which I just loved. The American Association catered strictly to lower class, to the working class, which in most of the cities that they were in meant fairly new immigrants. The first teams, when they formed, the teams were the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which are currently the Cincinnati Reds. The St. Louis Browns, which have turned into the Cardinals. The Pittsburgh Alleghenies, which are the Pirates. A team from Louisville called the Eclipse. The Philadelphia Athletics, the Brooklyn Grays, which have morphed into the Dodgers, and the Baltimore Orioles. And in 1882, this was before Curt Welch played, but that was the first time that the American Association and the National League got together for a championship series, sort of a quasi-World Series. The American Association had different rules than the National League, and certainly a lot different rules than you would recognize. Now, when Curt Welch started playing, batters could request either a high ball or a low ball. A high ball being basically from the waist up, and a low ball being from the waist down to the knees. And you didn't walk much because you had to have 7 balls for a walk. Pitchers, at the beginning of the American Association's time, pitchers were not allowed to raise their hand above level with their shoulder. They had to throw side hand or underarm. There was one umpire on the field, and if you think umpires have to be tough today, back then, if people didn't like the call, they would often just start beating on an umpire. And Curt Welch himself, one time, attacked an umpire and started beating on him in an elevator. And the umpire had to make all the calls, for the whole field. Let's see. Another thing to keep in mind, this is what's known, for those of you who aren't familiar with baseball, this is what's known as the dead ball era. And there's different reasons for this. Part of it is in the ball, and part of it was in the way they played. For one thing, in about 1880, a baseball cost the equivalent in today's money of about $45. And they were very reluctant to use a lot of baseballs like they do now, in a game. And they weren't made as hard either, and they were allowed to throw spitballs. They were allowed to spit on the baseball, which meant tobacco juice. And the ones who didn't chew tobacco liked to chew licorice. And so there was also licorice and tobacco juice. And as the game progressed, the ball would get softer and softer, and so there wasn't a lot of home runs hit. Another reason being that some of the stadiums at the time had outfield dimensions that are just absolutely ridiculous. The early National League team, the Boston Red Stockings, which I forget, they're not the Red Sox now, they turned into another team. but they had, their center field distance was 635 feet. So there wasn't a lot of home runs hit. Curt Welch, throughout his whole career, never used a glove. And during the time that he played, people started using gloves. Most of them were not, most of them were more like leather work gloves than what you would think of as being a baseball glove. But Curt Welch never wore one, and catchers at the early part of his career did not wear a baseball glove. And I've seen photos of catchers' hands that had played for some years, and it was just horrible. They broke their fingers and their hands and their wrists just continuously, and they were just, deformed. And another interesting thing about early baseball is that the fans were called cranks. Nobody seems to really be able to agree where that comes from, but they were called cranks. So Curt Welch played for the Blue Stockings in 1884, and one thing interesting about that is at the same time, that same year, there was another player from just down the river who is recognized as the first African-American black baseball player. His name was Moses Fleetwood Walker. And he played 1 year in the major leagues. He played professional ball longer than that. He only played 1 year in the major leagues, and that was the year that Curt Welch was on the same team. And he was born in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, which is in Jefferson County. It's a Quaker town. And if you're going to be black and be born before the Civil War, that was a good place to be born, in the middle of Quakers in Ohio. And his family moved to Steubenville. His dad was a doctor, and he ended up going to Oberlin College. And by all accounts, this Walker was quite a brilliant guy. He excelled at school. He ended up, by the time he died, he had several patents for everything from stuff to do with Nickelodeon projectors and some kind of artillery, using some kind of gunpowder or something. So he was quite an interesting fellow. But Curt Welch, there's not any information about what Curt Welch thought of playing with a black man. But as the season progressed, this poor fellow, who seems to have been an excellent, who could have made it in the major leagues had he been allowed to continue. There were teams, they didn't have much trouble in the Northeast, but when they went to play teams like the Louisville team in Kentucky, basically the other teams just said, we're not going to play if he's playing. And so they'd have to set him. And even some of his teammates, one pitcher, admitted later that Walker was the best catcher that he'd ever pitched to, but he refused to listen to the signs that the catcher gave him because he was black, and he would make sure and throw another pitch. And eventually Walker only ended up playing 42 games. And he was basically, all the teams eventually got together. It wasn't an official agreement. There was never an official agreement in baseball to keep blacks out. It was just something they got together and decided. And he never played in the majors again. Interestingly, his brother also played that same year for just a few games. There actually was another black that some people contend was the first, and this is apropos of nothing. It's just kind of interesting, who was half black, and he played for, I think, maybe one game in the late 1870s, and some people contend that he was the first black player. But others say no, he wasn't, because he passed as white. He was of mixed race parents, and since he passed himself as a white person, they said he doesn't count. And interestingly, his name was White. And another thing that's totally unrelated, but I found that there was a Negro League baseball team in East Liverpool that was called the Kellard Barbers. And I think they were only together for years. Anybody heard of them before? In 1885, Welch was signed by the St. Louis Browns. And throughout the American Association's short existence, the Browns were the premier team in the league. And he was assigned to center field. And he was so good by this time that another club offered St. Louis $10,000 for him in 1885. They were managed by Charlie Comiskey, which may be a name familiar to a few people. He was a player, he played first base, and he was a manager. And him and Curt Welch had a interesting up and down relationship. And something else that I didn't know until I was researching this was that the St. Louis Browns came to East Liverpool in August of 1885, that year, and played the Crockery City team here at the West End Ballpark. And let's see, the review reported it seemed as though the entire male population of East Liverpool, with a fair sprinkling of ladies, had gathered on the ball grounds. And they actually played them quite well. They lost, East Liverpool lost only 11-7. And the most amazing thing of all is the game took 1 hour and 45 minutes. Anymore, you're lucky if you get out of a ball game in 3 hours. Welch seemed throughout his career to be two different people. There was the Curt Welch baseball season, and there was Curt Welch in the off season. And they were two quite different people. And every winter, they would report on Curt Welch, on what he was doing in the winter. It was in numerous newspapers. And they would say he's growing stout, and that he will always announce he's quit drinking this winter, and that he's been staying at home with his wife, with his kids. I haven't seen him out on the town. One year they said Curt Welch says he has sworn off liquor for good. He was sick, nigh unto death for several days, and that frightened him. The amount of personal information that they put about these ball players in the newspaper is just terrible. Curt Welch seemed to, I haven't completed my research, but I think I have suspicions that he wasn't the first Irishman that had a problem with whiskey. His father-in-law, and they seemed to like to drink together, his father-in-law once got drunk and sold his house for $200. And when Curt Welch wasn't in the area, he was on the West Coast playing exhibition games at the time. But when him and his wife got home, they found her dad was living in the poorhouse, in the county poorhouse, because he had sold his house. His son, Curtis Jr., this is after his dad had passed away, but his son seemed to have had a drinking problem his whole life. And he also liked to beat on his mother, and was arrested several times for that. So by and large, it was a drinking family. And Curt Welch, that was his worst enemy. Because you can hardly, even in the early part of his career, you can hardly read a notice about him that doesn't have something about some kind of liquor or drinking mentioned with it. He had a serious problem. He was 5'10" and 175 pounds. He was known to be handsome. He would even keep beer behind the scoreboard in the center field and have a beer between innings. The New York World described him as a strange and wonderful mixture of horse, alligator, and boa constrictor. He has a head like a plow driver and a voice like a Bowery auctioneer. And a lot of people attributed his great play to extraordinary hearing. And there is a story that's obviously not true, that they put a black hood over him one time and somebody hit a baseball to the outfield, and because of his great hearing, he was able to go back on the ball and catch it with a hood over his head, which is just silly. But one time he ran, he was rough and tough. One time he ran through a fence. It was reported in numerous newspapers. He ran through an outfield fence and still managed to catch the ball. And he also liked to knock people down. This was a time when baseball wasn't as much of a gentleman's sport as it never was, but it was less of a gentleman's sport than it is now. And he was known usually by the opposition as a rather dirty player. This notice from the Evening Review in 1889, Curt Welch fully sustained his reputation as a dirty ball player yesterday when he ran into Tommy at second. He could have prevented it as the ball beat him by 6 feet, yet he struck Tommy in the chest with his arms and knocked him down and started a brawl. And it got so bad later on in his, a little bit later in his career, when he was playing in Baltimore, he had committed what everybody thought was a bad play a few games before, and he slid into somebody at Baltimore and knocked him down, and the fans actually rioted and came onto the field, and he ended up getting arrested and spent the night in jail. So this was rough and tumble baseball. One thing Welch was known for above all else, other than his fielding, was getting hit by pitches. And a lot of people didn't like it because he obviously just stepped in front of every pitch that he could. And to this day, he is 15th all time in hit by pitches in the major leagues.
171 donuts.
And so they supposedly, the American Association, because of his propensity for getting hit by pitches, actually changed the rules. Lifetime, he was a 263 hitter. I think the highest that he ever hit was later on. He hit 282 one year. He was mostly known as a defensive player as opposed to an offensive player, but he was certainly a solid offensive player batter. I like this notice in the Boston Globe. It said Curt was called tricky, but never by the team for which he played. Strangely enough, some of his methods were not in strict accordance with the rules, but he made runs. Welch, at the height of his career, made somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000, and this was at a time, I looked it up, the average salary was about $450 a year, which would put him well over $500,000 a year in today's money. And he seemed to have loved spending the money, because even when he was making that kind of money, most winters he came home and worked at the pottery. And if I was making $500,000 or $750,000 a year, I doubt I would apply for a job at the pottery. In 1886, in the World Series between the St. Louis Browns and the Chicago White Sox, which are now the Cubs, it's the same team that is now the Cubs of the National League. They played a World Series, and in the final game, in the 10th inning, Welch was on third, and they called it the $15,000 slide because of the prize money, and it's known as the most famous baseball play of the 19th century. The story goes that Welch stole home to win the game for the Browns. What most likely happened was it was a passed ball by the catcher, and Welch simply trotted home and scored the winning run. But that one thing, he was very famous for that. In 1888, he went to the Philadelphia Athletics, and I have no idea. It's not the Athletics that are now in Oakland. It was a different team. I have no idea what they are now. He played well there, but he still had a drinking problem, and that was basically when his play started to get downhill. That year, when they played Louisville, Welch, I guess he had quite a lot of jewelry that he liked to wear, and a gold watch, and he had a diamond necklace, and him and another friend of his on the team, they were drinking, and they decided they'd look for women. I guess he drank enough that he forgot about Anna Welch back here in East Liverpool. But they met a couple girls, and they got together with them, and walked down along the river, I guess, and they decided they would spend the night together, and you know this is not going to end well. Anyway, he woke up in the morning, and just about everything that those girls could take off of him was missing, including thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. There are numerous stories with Curt Welch, things. One where him and a friend were drinking in a bar, and even though none of them had really been around racehorses, they got to arguing over who was the best jockey. And they went out and found a couple horses and had a race. And they both got thrown. Neither of them got seriously hurt. When they reported it in the newspaper three days later, the Welch still hadn't found the horse he was riding. That was just typical, and it was about this time in 1891 that he first started to show signs of tuberculosis. In the sporting life, they said that his throat trouble seems to be worse than ever, and for days together he is unable to speak above a whisper. His lungs may become affected. His father and several brothers have died in the last few years of consumption. He would eventually die of consumption, but that kind of consumption wasn't really his biggest problem. The owner of the St. Louis Browns, who him and Curt Welch did not get along well, Curt Welch said the owner was a drunk, and the owner said Curt Welch was a drunk, and he finally had enough of Curt Welch, and Welch went to the Cincinnati Red Stockings, Baltimore Orioles. I must have missed a page because I know this isn't right. Yeah, he went to the Baltimore Orioles next, and he still played fairly well, but they got tired of his antics too, and in the off season, his old friend Charlie Comiskey was now with the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and he begged him to give him another chance. And Comiskey, against his better judgment, said, "We'll give you one more chance," but he wasn't allowed to touch a drop of drink. Welch said he'd reformed. Welch reformed regularly every offseason, but before the year was over, the same old thing had started again, and he was let go. And he came home and he worked at the McNichol Pottery for $1.50 a day in the off season. And of course, that off season he stayed home. He didn't drink. He stayed with his family. He turned over a new leaf, and then baseball season started, and it was the same thing over again. The next year, he played for the Louisville Colonels, which at that time was a team in the National League. He was only 31 years old, but he had already, it seems like the drinking had affected his play somewhat. That would be the last year he played in the Major League. As he progressed, he went downward from lower into lower leagues one after another. The next year he played in Syracuse of the Eastern League, which was a professional league, but not a major league, probably the equivalent now of a AAA team. And then the year after that, he went in the Pennsylvania State League, a team in Carbondale, which would be about like rookie ball today. And that was it. 1895 was the end of his baseball career. In 1896, he's back at home in East Liverpool. The Cincinnati Enquirer said Curt Welch is at his old home in East Liverpool, forlorn and penniless. Curt never did get it in his head that booze and baseball do not go together. Whiskey has not only brought him to the verge of the poorhouse, but has undermined a once wonderful constitution. And by June of the summer of 1896, Welch was hospitalized with what they called hasty consumption, which I don't know what that actually means. And he was well liked by a lot of the teams. The Cincinnati Reds, despite having been finished with his antics as a player, they got together and gathered some of their salary and sent him some money. And here in East Liverpool, a bunch of local friends organized a benefit game. And they held the benefit game on June 30th, 1896, and it was the Crockery City versus the East Liverpool Eclipse, and it was the West End Park. And there were 2,500 people there. And they raised $500 for Welch. And Welch was able to be at the game, though he was quite sick at the time and couldn't even talk, they said. By August the 25th, he was bedfast. And on August the 26th, he lost consciousness. And just like in a Hollywood movie, on August the 28th, he sat up, talked to his family, and then died the next day. And the obituaries, this one from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch: the news of Curt Welch's death will come as a blow. Browns fans have pleasant memories of the brave, genial fellow who oft made raptured multitudes jump to their feet and cheer themselves hoarse. Welch was no man's enemy save his own. Drink ruined him. Poor Curt Welch. Fielders have come and gone, but his like is yet to be seen. And then in sporting life, Curt Welch no more, once great player's earthly career closed, leaving his family in destitute circumstances. And my favorite, from the Hometown Evening Review, played his last game. Death was the umpire and called Curt Welch out. His poor widow, Anna, was destitute after he died, and she even tried to sell his baseball memorabilia. And she seems to have had a pretty rough life all in all. Her son Curtis Jr., even though her husband wasn't around to cause trouble, her son Curtis Jr. took the mantle, and besides drinking, he beat on her, and she lived until 1943 when she died. Both of them were buried at the, what is it, Spring Grove Cemetery. Though Curt Welch doesn't have a stone. And that's all I have. Any questions?
Did he ever get in the Hall of Fame?
No. No, there was nobody from the American Association ever made it to the Hall of Fame. When they folded and some of the teams just went defunct and then some were integrated into the National League, there was a lot of anger for a lot of years in the National League because they had tried from the beginning to get rid of the American Association. And then, strangely enough, just not too many years after the American Association folded, then the American League came along, and this time they weren't able to stop them. But nobody that played in the American Association made it to the Hall of Fame, other than a few players that started there and made it into the National League later, and were known more for what they did in the National League.
Was the Gray team spelled with an A or an E?
A.
Mm-hmm. It was a black league. It was a Grays.
Yeah.
Homestead Grays.
Mostly what?
The Homestead Grays.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the Dodgers, and they had quite a few names. I was looking, I don't even remember some of them. They were called the Trolley Dodgers before they were called the Dodgers because of where they were in Brooklyn. But some of these teams had a ridiculous number of different names through the years. Any more questions?
Would you tell us about your hat?
Oh, you know, this is the first time, I should have mentioned it earlier because normally I would never give a talk with a hat on my head. But since this is basically the kind of hat that they wore back then. The only difference being that they were made of wool. All their uniform was made of wool flannel. So that's why I have this hat on. When Tim gave a talk out at the state park not long ago, you know, in their promotional picture, they had put a picture of him in a top hat. And I went out to the talk just to see Tim in the top hat. I didn't care about the talk. And when I got there, he didn't have a hat on. So I'm not going to be that rude. That's why I'm wearing the hat.
You had mentioned about there was a smattering of women.
Yeah.
Was that common, that there would be just a few women?
I think especially with the American Association, because it was rough and tumble. It was more men. But I think there were certainly plenty of women who went to ball games, you know. But the American Association, because the National League was more refined, I imagine that they had a lot more women that went. But I mean, I've seen a lot of early pictures with, you know, a lot of women at the ball games. But I don't think it was to the extent that it is now, you know. I have two former teachers here today, including my first grade teacher, and I just am basking in the irony. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you for listening.
Any Welch descendants still in the area?
I don't know. Yeah, I wonder. It was another thing confusing, and like on the one baseball card, it actually says Welsh.
Yes.
And you see Welsh just as much as Welch, and then towards the when he started playing, it was almost always Welch. Though Welsh still showed up from time to time, but on official records like his death certificate and that sort of thing, it's always given as Welch. So I went with Welch.
What would one of his baseball cards go for today, you think?
I was going to buy one of these. I saw one on eBay, and this very one, in pretty decent shape, and it was $350. And so I just printed this out. You know, when you look at these old pictures of these teams from the 19th century, the one thing that sticks out most of all is the mustaches are just like monumental. I mean, there was one guy that had one that it just it's like a mud flap. It just completely covered the bottom of his face. And they asked him about it one time, and he said that the reason so many ball players had big mustaches, and he acted like he really believed, he thought it controlled the humidity, and that way they could see better. But going to a game, it would just look like a bunch of mustaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.